At 6:15 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Second Lieutenant Charles Cohen climbed into the cockpit of his Brewster F2A Buffalo on Midway Atoll with the kind of silent dread only a pilot feels when he knows his aircraft won't save him. The Buffalo was obsolete, and everyone on the island knew it. The Marines had nicknamed it the Flying Coffin, not out of humor, but out of grim acceptance. It was overweight, underpowered, and hopelessly outclassed by the Japanese fighters it would face in less than an hour. Cohen was only 22. He had been stationed at Midway for 3 weeks. This morning would be his first combat mission. When radar detected a massive Japanese air raid 93 miles out, closing fast, he knew that first mission might be his last. 36 Zeros escorted the incoming bombers, sleek silver machines that climbed faster, turned tighter, and reacted instantly to the pilot's touch. American doctrine insisted that no one should ever try to dogfight with a Zero. Use hit-and-run tactics, keep speed, avoid turning engagements. But the Buffalo had no advantages to use. It was slower, heavier, sluggish, trapped in its own outdated design. That morning, the Marines had 21 Buffaloes and 7 F-4F Wildcats. The Wildcats were only marginally better. Most men, like Cohen, were assigned to Buffaloes because that's all there was. 26 fighters launched to defend Midway. 14 pilots never came back. The Buffalo had not always been a death sentence. When it first flew in 1937, it was a leap forward for the U.S. Navy, a monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear to replace aging biplanes. The prototype exceeded 300 miles per hour and handled well enough to justify optimism. But everything changed once production began. The Navy wanted more range, more fuel, heavier guns, armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks. Every addition made sense on its own. Collectively, they killed the aircraft. The Buffalo gained so much weight that its original engine could no longer handle the load. By the time the final F2A-3 version entered service in 1941, it was carrying 1,300 extra pounds. The max speed dropped, the climb rate collapsed, and the aircraft's small wings struggled to lift the overweight fuselage. The Buffalo became slow to respond, heavy in the controls, prone to stalling at low speeds, and structurally fragile in the landing gear. Pilots said it wallowed through turns like it was moving through water. And the worst part was that everyone already knew this before Midway. The Buffalo had been tested under fire early in 1942 in Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. The results were disastrous. British and Dutch pilots tried desperately to use proper tactics, but in a Buffalo there were no good tactics. Zeros and Key, 43 Oscars tore through the squadrons, catching any Buffalo that tried to run, turning inside any Buffalo that tried to fight, and punishing any pilot who hesitated. Dutch pilots, flying a slightly lighter export version, lost most of their aircraft within months. They called the Buffalo a death trap. Yet despite the warnings, the United States Marine Corps kept Buffaloes on Midway for one reason: nothing else was available. The newer, better fighters were reserved for carriers and Hawaii. Midway received whatever remained. Marine Fighter Squadron 221, commanded by Major Floyd Parks, had trained for months with the Buffalo's limits. Parks, an experienced pilot since 1931, knew exactly how inferior his squadron's aircraft were. He had read the reports from Asia, seen the casualty lists, and understood what awaited his boys. But there was no choice. On June 4th, just before dawn, he briefed his squadron. He emphasized altitude, formation, discipline. He told them to avoid prolonged dogfights. They all knew those tactics depended on having an airplane capable of executing them. The Buffalo wasn't. When radar detected the incoming raid at 5:55, Parks ordered an immediate launch. 26 fighters scrambled into the pale morning sky, climbing desperately toward 30,000 feet. Parks arranged his units into 5 divisions, 4 of Buffaloes and 1 of Wildcats. Around 6:40, he spotted the enemy, more than 100 Japanese aircraft approaching Midway at 14,000 feet. For one brief moment, Parks had the advantage. His squadron was above the Japanese formation. He ordered the attack and dove with his division straight toward the bombers below. 5 Buffaloes against more than 100 enemy aircraft. They fired once, one clean pass, before the Zeros pounced. Parks broke away after hitting a bomber, only to find 3 Zeros diving onto his tail. He tried to escape by diving, but the Zeros followed effortlessly. He tried to turn, but the Buffalo lagged behind his commands. The Japanese fighters closed the distance and shot him to pieces. Cannon shells shredded his wing and fuselage. Smoke poured from the engine. Parks aimed his crippled fighter toward the island, hoping to crash-land. He never got the chance. At 5,000 feet the Buffalo broke apart, its weakened structure unable to withstand the stress. Parks died instantly. His entire division was wiped out in less than 7 minutes. Kuhn, flying in the 3rd Division, saw it happen. He watched Buffalo after Buffalo plunged toward the sea, burning. Then the Zeros came for him. He had seconds, just seconds, to decide. Doctrine said keep speed, keep altitude, stay out of turns. But the Zeros were already there, already inside his turning circle. He banked hard, pulling back on the stick, but the Buffalo answered too slowly. A Zero snapped around behind him and opened fire. Tracers sliced past his canopy, cannon shells cracked into the fuselage, and smoke filled the cockpit. He dove, but the aircraft wouldn't respond. Hits shattered his instruments. The engine seized. The Buffalo shook violently as the propeller froze. Kuhn knew he was going down. He kept the nose level long enough to build a little speed and ditched 3 miles from Midway. He survived only because rescue boats reached him minutes before the aircraft sank beneath the waves. Of the 26 Marine fighters launched, 17 were shot down. 14 Buffaloes were destroyed. VMF-221 ceased to exist as a fighting unit. The Japanese lost 5 fighters. The kill ratio was catastrophically lopsided. Pilots who survived said the same thing. The Buffalo was too slow to escape, too heavy to maneuver, too weakly armed to bring down enemies quickly. Even when they inflicted damage, they couldn't pursue their targets long enough to finish the job. The few Marines who scored kills did so through desperation, not through the Buffalo's design. After the battle, no pilot ever wanted to fly a Buffalo again. They grounded every remaining one, stripped them for parts, and used their empty shells as gunnery targets. The Buffalo's combat career with the U.S. military died at Midway. It had lasted just half a year. But the Buffalo was not unique. Other nations produced fighters just as deadly for their own pilots. Germany, despite creating some of the war's most formidable fighters, produced one of its greatest disasters, the Messerschmitt Me 210. It was supposed to replace the Bf-110, but instead it nearly sank Messerschmitt's reputation and endangered every pilot who touched it. Work on the Me 210 began in 1937, before the Bf-110 had even reached full production. Messerschmitt engineers promised a multi-role aircraft that could serve as a heavy fighter, reconnaissance plane, and fast bomber. The Reich Air Ministry was so convinced of its brilliance that it ordered 1,000 of them before the first prototype ever flew. It was one of the costliest mistakes they ever made. The first prototype flew on September 2, 1939, and the problems were immediate. The aircraft suffered violent instability, yawing, oscillating, swinging unpredictably even during straight flight. In turns, it snapped into dangerous attitudes with no warning. Engineers tried everything, replacing tail designs, adding leading-edge slats, modifying controls. Nothing worked. One prototype crashed in 1940 after entering an unrecoverable spin. Pilots feared the aircraft. Messerschmitt's own chief test pilot declared that the Me-210 possessed every undesirable trait an airplane could have. Yet production continued because the Luftwaffe was desperate for a Bf-110 replacement. They built 16 prototypes and 94 pre-production aircraft trying to fix it. The fundamental problem lay in its aerodynamics, the wing design, the short fuselage, the center of gravity placement. These were flaws no quick fix could solve. Still, deliveries to frontline units began in 1942. Pilots hated it instantly. It was unstable in combat, unreliable in landings, and dangerous in turbulence. The landing gear collapsed frequently, killing several pilots in routine operations. By April 1942, only 90 Me-210s had been delivered when the Luftwaffe made an extraordinary decision: cancel production. They restarted production of the outdated Bf-110 rather than risk more lives on the 210. More than 300 partially assembled Me-210s were shoved into storage, unwanted. Messerschmitt tried salvaging the program with the Me-410, a redesigned version that did fix many flaws, but the reputation damage from the 210 lingered for years. Italy's disaster was even worse. The Breda Ba.88 Lince looked sleek, modern, and fast. In 1937, the prototype set world speed records. Fascist propaganda hailed it as proof that Italian engineering rivaled the greatest powers on Earth. But once real military equipment was added, the aircraft gained more than 2,000 pounds. Its twin engines remained the same. Performance crashed. The production version couldn't exceed 200 miles per hour. It could barely climb. Italian test pilots begged the Air Ministry to cancel it. They were ignored. Politics mattered more than survival. When Italy entered the war, squadrons equipped with the Ba.88 tried to fly missions in Libya. Desert sand filters reduced the already weak engine power by another 30%. The aircraft became nearly unflyable. On one mission, 3 Ba.88s attempted to take off with full loads to attack a British airfield. One couldn't gain enough speed and aborted. Another took off but immediately lost altitude and returned. The commander of the third aircraft managed to get airborne but couldn't climb above 500 meters. He jettisoned his bombs and returned in humiliation. The mission failed completely. Not a single aircraft reached the target. By November 1940, every Ba.88 in North Africa was grounded. They stripped the aircraft, salvaged radios and guns, and scattered the empty airframes across airfields to act as decoys for British reconnaissance. This was the only useful role the Ba.88 ever performed. A record-breaking prototype had become a useless shell in just 3 years. These 3 aircraft, the Brewster Buffalo, the Messerschmitt Me 210, and the Breda Ba.88, shared the same tragic pattern. They began with promise. They were crippled by weight increases, rushed decisions, and political pressure. They killed more of their own pilots than enemy pilots. At Midway, 14 Marine aviators died in one morning because bureaucrats insisted the Buffalo was still viable. Major Floyd Parks, an experienced pilot, was killed simply because his aircraft couldn't do what he needed it to do. Kuhn survived only because he ditched close enough to shore. German pilots flying the Me-210 died in training accidents caused not by the enemy, but by the aircraft itself. Italian pilots faced the humiliation of flying machines that couldn't even take off with a combat load. The psychological toll was devastating. Pilots accept the risks of combat. What they cannot accept is dying because of decisions made by people far from the battlefield. At Midway, Buffalo pilots knew before they took off that they were outmatched. They flew anyway. Survivors described a helplessness unlike anything they had felt in training. They followed their doctrine, executed their maneuvers, did everything right, and still got shot down because the aircraft could not perform. Captain Marion Carl, one of the few survivors, later said the Buffalo pilots didn't die because they lacked skill. They died because they were sent into combat with inferior equipment. German pilots refused the Me-210 whenever they could. Italian pilots requested transfers to older aircraft because even outdated biplanes were safer than the Ba.88. The failures exposed deeper, systemic problems in how nations procured aircraft during wartime. The Navy kept the Buffalo in service because there was nothing else ready, and admitting its failure would expose the flaws in the procurement system. Germany ordered 1,000 Me-210s before testing because they assumed engineers could fix any problem later. Italy pushed the Ba.88 into production for propaganda purposes, ignoring test results altogether. In every case, the pilots paid the price. Young men in their early 20s who climbed into cockpits knowing full well that their aircraft might kill them before the enemy even had a chance. The lessons learned from these failures came slowly and at enormous cost. The Buffalo taught engineers that adding weight without increasing engine power is fatal for fighter performance. The Me-210 proved that aerodynamic instability cannot be fixed with patches. Some designs are flawed at the fundamental level. The Ba.88 demonstrated the danger of designing aircraft for show instead of combat reality. And the most painful lesson of all was that the courage of pilots cannot compensate for the failures of those who send them into battle with the wrong tools. Midway, the skies over Europe, and the desert of North Africa were littered with wrecks that never should have existed, silent witnesses to the consequences of bad decisions made far from the battlefield.